Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits and I'm here with Dyer Supplier to demonstrate one way that you can create beautiful speckled yarn using Jacquard acid dye powder. There are many different ways that you can speckle yarn, and the technique we are going to do today involves applying the dry acid dye powder to the wet yarn in a low immersion situation. Since the yarn is exposed to acid and heat already, the colors will strike fast. And I'm going to be applying the dye today with my gloved fingertips. But there are some other ways that you can apply the dye to the yarn that I'll talk about at the very end of this video in the conclusions. Personal safety is really important, and whenever you're dealing with dry acid dye powders, or really any kind of dye powder, you want to make sure that you're wearing some kind of respirator, safety glasses, and gloves. In addition, since everything we're using today are commercial dyes, all of the tools and equipment are dedicated dye equipment and are not also used for food. Acid dyes are used to dye protein-based yarns: wool, alpaca, silk, cashmere, and unfortunately they won't work on cellulose fibers like cotton and bamboo, or synthetics like acrylic and polyester. Today we are going to dye 200 grams of the Dyer Supplier Silvery Sock Base. This yarn is 60% superwash merino, 20% nylon, and 20% stellina. This yarn is jam-packed with silvery stellina and has a beautiful, beautiful sparkle. The silvery sock yarn base differs from the sparkle sock because it has about double the amount of stellina. The sparkle sock is only 10% stellina. And it's enough that the base actually has a little bit of a silvery gray tinge. I am pre-soaking the yarn in some plain tap water for at least 30 minutes. And I have added on some of these reusable nylon zip ties so that way I can easily manipulate the yarn in our pan. Today we are going to speckle with a combination of Jacquard Jet Black, Hot Fuchsia, and Turquoise. This is a full-size catering chafer pan. I have it across 2 burners on my stovetop. It's 4 inches deep, and I love using this for low immersion because you can really spread out the yarn. Currently we have 4 cups of water, and I'm going to add 4 tablespoons or a 1/4 cup of white vinegar. I have gently squeezed out most of the water from our yarn. Now, as we add it to the pot, I'm not going to add it like this. Instead, I'm going to turn the yarn and add it so that way that, it's looped around this way. This will allow us to get a lot more access to the top half of the fiber at the same time, and will help give us a more balanced colorway. In these steam pans, I can comfortably fit 300 grams of yarn, or 3 skeins of yarn, but I most frequently prefer to do 2 because I feel like I can spread things out a bit more and get better coverage of color overall. So with 4 cups of water in here, you can see we are at really low immersion. There is plenty of water that you can see if I squish, but a lot of the yarn is at or above the surface. And so this will allow the dyes to strike, but not necessarily spread out too much as we start speckling. For preservation of the colors, I will only go into the containers with dry hands and making sure I wash and dry my gloves or use a clean spoon before going into a different color. This way I won't contaminate them with any of the other colors I'm using. These jars are a little too narrow for me to reach in and pull up a little pinch of the dye powder. So I will be aliquoting a small amount of powder into some dedicated dye cups so that way I can easily reach and control the amount of dye I'm picking up. I have a little bit of the jet black dye in a cup, and so that way I can reach and grab it and start speckling. My preferred way to speckle is to pick up a tiny amount of dye in my fingertips, and then gently and slowly rub them together. You can see I'm barely moving them, so this way I'm only allowing tiny, tiny amounts of dye to fall and hit the yarn. You can see that I only picked up the barest amount of the dye powder. and then I'm barely moving my fingers, watching as these particles slowly fall onto our yarn. If you take a closer look, you can see that we have a mixture of tiny sharp speckles where just one speck of dye landed on our wet yarn. And then there's some bigger patches where a little bit more hit at once. You also can notice that we see multiple hues in here. There are some browns and a little bit of pink, and this is because Jacquard Jet Black is made up of a mixture of different pigments. And so seeing different colors like this is called breaking. Not all dye colors break, but there are a fair number that do. And so this is something to keep in mind as you're playing with your projects. And it is really fun to take advantage of this as you are speckling. Whoop. So if you want larger speckles, then you can pick up more dye and go a little heavier. For lighter speckles, try to just get enough of the powder on your dry gloves so that way you can just flick little bits of powder onto the yarn. You might notice with the turquoise that things are spreading out a bit more. Some colors will strike really fast, others require more acid, heat, and time. A tiny amount of powder goes a really long way when you are speckling. And I like going directly into the powder. Some people might prefer to use some kind of dusting wand or some kind of shaker, but I really like the tactile approach because it really helps me control exactly where I am adding the color. Now that you saw that a few colors can speckle differently, the black speckles with breaking, and so you can see multiple pigments in there. The hot fuchsia speckles really sharply, and so we have much more defined specks there. Whereas the turquoise spreads a little bit more. All is totally beautiful, and it really ultimately will come down to what you prefer in your colorway. But that's the magic of dyeing yarn at home. If you want to have sharper speckles, then you can dilute your dye powder by mixing it with something like citric acid powder. The reason why I chose not to do that today is for two reasons. One, I wanted a heavier layer of speckles on the yarn, so I decided to go with the direct powder. But two, you need to be careful when you're using citric acid with yarns that have stellina. If you end up with a solution that is too acidic, you can lose some of the luster of the stellina over time. And so therefore, to avoid this, most dyers prefer to use vinegar when dyeing sparkle yarns like this. Not that a tiny amount of citric acid will necessarily damage the stellina. It could probably be fine, but I figure it's better to be safe than sorry. This colorway is so much fun. We now have pink speckles throughout, then black, and then finally some blue. Now I am going to let everything sit on low heat for 10 minutes. It's been 10 minutes, and now we're going to flip the yarn to dye the other side. And you can see just how much I love these zip ties because they make flipping the yarn over so simple. And so then I can flip it this way and spread things out. If I didn't have the tie, then I would get a lot more nervous about whether I was going to accidentally tangle anything, but I like this a lot. The water is hot, so if you can't comfortably touch it, because it's warm, it's not like incredibly hot, then you should do this with tongs. But you can see we still have plenty of water in here, and I am going to go ahead and add our speckles in a similar kind of pattern to this side off camera. Once again, I am going to wait 10 minutes and then we can turn off the heat. layering different colors of powder on top of each other is so much fun. It's like a party on yarn. Okay, the colors have set, and if I lift things up, you can see that there's very little color left behind. The nice thing about speckling is that if you see an area that requires more color, you can go in and add it. But overall, it is fun, and I am thrilled with how this has turned out. I'm going to turn off the heat, and since the water level is so low in here already, I'm going to leave the yarn in the pan to cool completely so we can go wash it. Now let's wash our sparkly, sparkly speckled yarn. We're not seeing any bleeding, and that is great. I'm adding a little bit of some clear dish soap, and I am going to rinse this a few more times just to make sure our water is clear. After another rinse to remove the soap, I am going to take the yarn and hang it up to dry. Here is the finished dry yarn. The color coverage is sparse and speckled, and you can have so much fun layering your speckles and colors on top of one another, or keeping the colors a little more separated and individual. Speckled yarns are frequently non-repeating because there's a randomness element to it, and so you won't necessarily see pooling. However, in the way that we added the speckles onto this yarn, you could see some pooling and almost a microstripe sectioning of the speckles because the section of blue is that much smaller than the overall section of pink. The Dyer Supplier Silvery Sock yarn base is packed with sparkle, and I am really excited to play around with this in more techniques in the future. Well, how's that for creating some really fun speckled yarn using some dry Jacquard acid dye powder and some low immersion techniques with the Dyer Supplier Silvery Sock yarn? Less is more with speckling. For the sharpest speckles, you really want like one drop of powder to hit the yarn. So if you apply the dye too heavy, you can still get really pretty results. It's just not quite going to give you those sharp speckles. Some people like to use dedicated salt shakers and dusting wands to apply speckles to their yarn. But for all the techniques that I have tried, I still prefer the tactile feel because I know as I'm moving my fingers together, I can release dye exactly where I want it. And I get more results that are consistent with what is in my head. But ultimately, it comes down to a little bit of experimentation. And you should try to have fun and play around with the different techniques to find out what works best for you. Jacquard has 40 different acid dye colors, and you can find all of them on the Dyer Supplier website. But you won't necessarily get a range of 40 different colors of speckles. As we saw in this video, the jet black dye does break. You see the black speckles, but there are also some red and yellow speckles in there. And so the same can be true for some of the other colors in the collection. You might see a mixture of different colors when you're speckling. Now, this is something you can take advantage of and create some stunning colorways, but it's also something to keep in mind as you are picking out your colors. I really hope that you enjoyed this video on how to create a speckled yarn with dry acid dye powder in a low immersion situation. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and if you would like to see more of my speckling yarn journey from my early attempts to where I got more successful, you can find me on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. You'll find a link in the video description. Speckles will work differently on different yarn bases, and I personally find that they work best on superwash yarns because in general acid dyes strike those yarns faster. To explore a variety of yarn bases with these techniques, head over to Dyer Supplier. They offer a wide range of ethically sourced and affordable yarn bases that vary in yarn weight and fiber content. If you are a little further along on your yarn dyeing adventures, there are bulk pricing and discounts available. And so you can find all the information at dyersupplier.com. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.